to hatred, to bigotry, to forms of racism, which ultimately, tragically, usually ends in violence. And therefore it's imperative that we learn the values of tolerance and respect at an early age, because wherever we go in life, that is the most important fundamental principle, to respect the humanity of every human being. We are very fortunate to have with us tonight a member of our community, Mr. Bruce Gendelman, who has devoted a great deal of his time in recent years towards teaching respect and tolerance and remembering the painful lessons we've learned when there is a lack of tolerance and respect for our fellow man, and he chooses to do this through the arts. And so I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight and thank Mr. Gendelman for coming tonight to speak with us. Mr. Gendelman is chairman of Bruce Gendelman Company, a national property and casualty insurance broker. The firm specializes and is one of the largest brokers nationally, writing very high net worth personal insurance and commercial programs for those clients. He founded the company in 1982 and has clients in all states and staff in 22 cities. Mr. Gendelman graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with an honors degree in economics, studied at the Graduate Business School in Real Estate Finance, and received his JD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a member of the State Bar of Wisconsin and the Florida Bar. He is the vice chairman of the Norton Museum of Art and actively involved with other non-for-profit organizations. Bruce is an accomplished artist, encompassing large-scale oil paintings, room-size installations, and photographs, and has recently had one-man shows in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Krakow, Poland. Bruce and his wife, Lori, have 4 grown children and 5 grandchildren and reside in Palm Beach. It's an honor to call upon my friend, Mr. Bruce Gendelman.
Thank you, Rabbi. Hi there. Well, I'm really delighted to be here. Can't tell you how important I think this type of arrangement is, where young students are exposed to mentors. And in thinking about the topic this evening about tolerance, I want to tie it into mentors. You know, when you are growing up, when you're young, you have a certain set of you have a certain set of people that you know and you meet. And I know in my life, and I'd like to spend just a few minutes on that, mentors that I encountered in my life growing up as a student particularly were extremely important in helping me figure things out. So, you know, when you sit and talk to somebody and as you go through school and you're going through classes or you meet other people, you have to always analyze what's going on, because everything's connected. Now that may sound a little strange, but every person you meet, everything you read, every TV show you watch is trying to influence you in a certain way. Politicians do it, newspapers do it. Let me ask you, everybody, I assume all you kids, you have a cell phone. Everybody, almost everybody? How many of you get news from Facebook? Anybody? News from Facebook? 1, 2. How many of you read actual physical newspapers? Anybody? There's a few. How many of you look at news on your phones? Okay. So you can take a topic, and it really doesn't matter what the topic is. This will get around to tolerance in a bit. But as you're exposed to information, you have to make the analysis of what that information is and how factual it is. Is it factual? Is it an opinion? Is someone trying to influence you? What's their agenda? So as you sit here with your mentors, or as you go through life and you meet with a teacher, you know, a great mentor will challenge you. And I think the best way they can challenge you is how to process information. So I've sort of thought about these things throughout my whole life when I was your age. And I want to talk about 3 mentors I had, briefly, and think about how that can apply to your life. So I had 3 great teachers in my life. I went to public school. I had When I was in third grade through 8th grade, I had a male art teacher, and his name was Alan Kaka. And what he taught us wasn't art, but it was how to view the world in a creative way. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's a lot of tools that teachers use. He at the time, was a very young teacher. He's still my friend. He's in his 80s. I email with him at least once a week and call him, often. And he was an extremely important person in my life. And the reason I do art today is largely because of him, because he taught me to look at the world through a creative lens. Another great teacher I had was a math teacher, freshman year math teacher at this very big public high school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And he taught like the smart kids, and I was lucky to get in his class. And he was incredibly strict. And he taught us math. And he didn't tolerate anybody not doing their homework. Everyone was afraid of this guy. But yet, everybody did the homework. Some people complained. But he taught us the discipline of how to think logically, which is a very important tool. This leads to that, leads to that. Mathematics, like science, is something that's very provable. Okay? So it's a very important thing, to think logically. The last great teacher I had, or another great teacher I had, I was in graduate business school. And he mentioned I was an economics major, but there was a class I had heard about in a real estate class. Okay. So I show up at the first day of class. I'm, 19 years old. And it's a big public university, University of Wisconsin. And I walk into this classroom, and there's 500 people in an auditorium, people sitting on the stairs, and I'm wondering, what did I get myself into? And this class starts, bell rings, there's no teacher. The door opens up on the side, and a man comes through who's a quadriplegic, and he had a ball with a stick in his mouth, going like this, and he said, "My name's James Grasscamp, and I'm going to teach you about real estate," this booming voice. And I ended up taking every class he taught for the next 2 years. So those three people were great mentors to me, and I've had others. But the point about the mentors is three different types of people, but they helped me in different ways to try to understand what's going around me. So that leads me to talk a little bit about tolerance. And what the rabbi said was perfect in terms of every person, actually every living thing has great value. Nobody's better than anybody else. If you're an immigrant, your family came over on the Mayflower, you're Jewish, you're Catholic, you have no religion, you're all the same. Everybody's the same. Everybody has great value. So the question is, how do you develop that value in your life? And being here with people who are very successful in business or philanthropy and talking with them is very important. And one of my hopes, I'm sure their hopes, is that you'll absorb this, you'll pick it up, you'll think about it, you'll become very satisfied people in your own lives. You'll influence other people, you'll teach other people, and you'll pass it along forward. There's a lot of ways to think about things, and when you have respect for people, and if you'll come across people perhaps who are a bully. Those are people who don't have respect for you. So the question is, how do you react to that? Or you come across a government, or gangs, or violence, or people that don't respect yourself or other people. How do you maneuver that in society? And it's very difficult sometimes. And you have to sometimes be very brave. So my artwork, which I'll get to in a bit, deals with the lack of tolerance. And it deals with what happens when a society is influenced. In this case, the example is with Nazi Germany, with ideology that Hitler and other people believed and used to create genocide around the world. So that's the ultimate example of what happens when there's no respect and no tolerance. You know, it's the golden rule in almost every religion. You know, treat each other like treat other people like you'd like to be treated yourself. Well, clearly that didn't happen. It doesn't happen. It's a very dangerous world in a lot of countries. I know few of you have left other places to come here to this country, and we're in very precarious times. So I want to tell you a story about some books, and having to do with tolerance and how to appreciate other people, because that's what it comes down to. And you can only do what you can do as an individual. You'll only meet the people you meet. But if everybody you meet, or almost everybody you meet, looks at you as an upstanding person, as someone who loves peace and loves other people, and isn't a bully and is kind to people and are willing to help, that goes a long way. Imagine if everybody you know did that. Imagine if everybody in Florida did that, everybody in the world did that. We wouldn't have enormous problems that we have. So talk about other mentors and other things. I want to use these as an example to talk about tolerance and what happens when they don't break down. So this is a book my father wrote. My father was, it's called The Tale of Two Soldiers. My father grew up poor in Milwaukee. His father was an immigrant. His father came from the Ukraine, part of Russia, and he was a very poor man and was a roofer. My father, by the time he was 6 years old, only spoke Yiddish. Yiddish is a peasant language that Jews spoke in Eastern Europe. And so during Pearl Harbor happened, World War II happened, and he enlisted in the army. He goes, long story, he's in the front lines of the Battle of the Bulge. So, again, everything is connected. So if you don't, talk about history for a reason, if you don't understand history, if you don't make a point of understanding history, you lose a whole set of framework on how to view life. And that goes with every discipline. And all this relates back to tolerance on how to lead your life. So if you don't understand history, or if you don't read history, you're going to repeat it. There's an old saying like that. So my father is in the front lines, and the Germans come through, and he's almost killed, but he escapes for a little bit, and it gets caught. He's a prisoner of war. Terribly mistreated. He escapes from prisoner of war camp. He gets picked up, put in another prisoner of war camp, escapes from that prisoner of war camp, then got picked up again, and got sent in railroad cars in 3 or 4 days without food, without water, people dying on the train. And he gets dumped into a prisoner of war camp. Long stories, which I don't have time for, but because he persevered and he valued life, and because he spoke Yiddish, this language that had no value here, he could understand German. And so he understood what the Nazis were saying, and he ended up escaping from that prisoner of war camp with a deserter from the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He came across, and he became his best friend in life. So if a Jewish boy, he was your age, he was 19, 20 years old, can be best friends with someone who lived in another country, who lived in a Nazi regime, best friends, that tells you a little story. I'm going to tell you another story about tolerance. This is a book by a Catholic priest from Paris, Father Patrick Dubois. Father Dubois is a man I met when I went to Poland in 2015, which was the inspiration for my artwork. He's a Catholic priest. He has dedicated his life to uncovering the massacre sites of Jews in Eastern Europe. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know, that 6 million or more, he actually believes that 7.4 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. When the Nazis took over a country in Eastern Europe, Poland being the first one, the first thing they did was to go from town to town in squads, round up the Jews and shoot them. Okay, talk about tolerance. That's the extreme where there's no tolerance. How could that happen? Okay, and you know, there's many Holocaust scholars, and I actually brought one here with me today. Arthur, can you raise your hand? And I'd like you to talk to him. Arthur is a very good friend of mine who was a diplomat with the U.S. State Department for a long time, and then worked for, I think, 12 years for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and he was introduced to us by this guy here, Ambassador Stuart Bernstein. So if you want the historical perspectives on how that can happen and what those facts were, Arthur's a great resource, and he'd be glad to talk to you. But you have to understand, a whole society allowed this to happen. That they were okay with it. It's them. It's not us. You know, as long as it's okay for my people. Well, I got a tax cut, it's fine, I can eat, I've got a job in the government. You know, even though my job is driving the train for the railway with people starving and they're shooting them, it's okay, no problem. That, unfortunately, is the base case about human nature. It can happen. It can happen again. It can happen very easily. Germany was a democratic country like this is. It was the most advanced country at the time like this is. So that's a cautionary tale. So you need to understand your life, your security, whatever your condition is. It could be better. It could be a lot worse too. And part of tolerance is thinking about society, not just individually, person to person, but also thinking about society. And you know, how can we build a framework where those elements that I believe are actually base cases in human nature aren't allowed to happen. And I'll get back to this in a minute, but I think when you have politicians, particularly leaders, imagine if you had a mentor, one of your mentors said, you know, it's okay if you know, we starve and shoot Hispanics. Okay, what would you think of that? Well, that's what happened in Germany. So Father Patrick Dubois, Catholic priest, dedicates his life. And he started, because he was a Catholic priest, he had unique access. This is before the Soviet Union fell. He would go from parish to parish in these tiny little towns and show up at the church. And he'd ask the pastor, you know, I'm a Catholic priest, I'm a scholar, which he is. My research is on how people were feeling during the war. And could I give a sermon? Could I meet some of your people? Sure. So he'd give a sermon, and afterwards, you know, general thing, you know, I know, you know, people had a hard time, people suffered. But if anyone wants to talk about their experience or have absolution, maybe they felt guilty about saying, I'll be over here, we'll talk. People would line up and they'd tell them stories. Yes, I was a baker in town, I was a school teacher, I was a little girl, this and that. Yeah, they rounded up the Jews and they shot them in a pit over here. Okay, so then later he would go with a metal detector and he'd count the bullets. Because the Nazis only felt a Jew only deserved one bullet. They would never spend 2 bullets on a Jew. And if they just wounded you, you'll sit in a pit and die for a little bit. And another thing they did, they didn't waste bullets on children. Any child under 8 years old or so, they just pick them up by the feet and smash their heads against the trees. So talk about tolerance. So Father Patrick Dubois, if you want to read one book about the Holocaust, I would suggest this. And this is before they started the death camps, Auschwitz, Birkenau, and the others. So that brings me to my art and a little bit about that. And I left outside, if anyone cares to have, I hope I have enough. These are a catalog for my art exhibition in Poland. So I took this trip, and you know, talk about mentors. Father Dubois was a mentor to me. My father, in good ways and bad ways, you know, you learn from everybody. And sometimes people will disappoint you. But that's part of living. The math teacher I mentioned, he had a terrible ending in a very disappointing, awful way. You know, but you have to adapt from that. So my art, I was very moved by going to this place, Auschwitz. and Birkenau. This was the big death camp in Poland, in Krakow, Poland, that the Nazis built as a factory. Think of this. Talk about tolerance. They built a factory to select people that they needed to run the industrial plants to keep the war machine going in Germany. Or if they didn't think they had any use for whatever purposes they have, they killed them. 92% of the people were dead within 2 hours. I don't know if you've heard of this or seen Schindler's List, but these are Dr. Mengele, an MD. Left, right, you live, you die. If you're an old man, or you're a cripple, or they didn't like the way you looked, you go over here, you wait in line, and they'd say, oh, you're gonna take a shower, and gas would come down, and they'd suffocate you. It would take about 20 minutes, you slowly die and suffocate in a room with 1,000 people, and then they would burn your bodies. But the lucky 8% that lived, they put them in these barracks, and they would work them in different jobs there, but also in the factories that surrounded it. They built factories near there, and they'd go work in the factories. And about 1 in 100 of those people survived. And those people that did survive the Holocaust, or lived through it one way or another, they're almost all dead now, because this was 75 years ago. So you had to be a very young person to even be alive. And when I came back, I was very emotionally disturbed that people would build a factory of intolerance to murder people and use them up like cattle. And even they would treat cattle better than this. And so I'm a photographer and I'm a hobby painter. I mentioned this art teacher. I've just been a hobby painter, but I started painting and painting. It got bigger and bigger, and then people started showing up. But then I would talk to a few groups, and then anyway, I had these 3 art shows. And you're welcome to take this. And there's some fold-out pages. I made some big dioramas, some big, almost room-sized sculptures to try to portray the horrors of what people can do to other people. So when you go through life, you know, the most important thing I can talk to you about is trying to fit all the pieces together. You know, there are certain people say they're an accountant. Well, they're really good with numbers, but they may not know anything about history or science or art. To me, anyway, it's real important to understand as much as you can about a lot of things. The narrower your focus, you know, the narrower you'll think. You say, well, I'm just an accountant, I just need to know about numbers, and you'll miss a lot. When you encounter people that aren't treating you or other people correctly, again, it takes courage. How do you stand up to them? What do you do? Who do you talk to? Maybe one of the last things I want to say is seek out people, not just the people here today. Seek out teachers. Ask for help. Ask for advice. And if you don't like the advice or they don't care, well then fine, maybe they're the wrong person, or maybe they don't have the right perspective to help you with that problem. Find somebody else. Keep going. Maybe your parents don't have the right education to help you with algebra, but they might have the right education to help you with how do you pick a mate in life, their advice, or whatever the topic is. So, you know, I think I'll stop there. That's sort of the big message. But I want to hear from you. I'd like to hear your questions, any struggles you might have. So let's talk. I'd like to keep it informal and talk.
Maya, if you don't mind projecting.
Yeah, I'll repeat it. She wanted to know if I've met a lot of Holocaust survivors. I'd say not really. You know, I'll tell you a story. So everyone has their own story, their own family story. When I grew up, I knew the story about my father being a prisoner of war, but until he actually wrote it down, I only knew 75% of it. 25% I didn't, and it was horrifying. But also growing up, so I'll tell you a story about the two sides of my family. His parents, my grandparents, they were lucky to come here before World War I. They came and sought asylum. They were refugees. They came here. And there were always stories about, oh, well, that uncle was killed by the Nazis. This cousin was killed. That whole family was killed. So I never got to meet all those people. On my mother's side, my grandfather David, who was a carpenter, was also an immigrant from Poland, the area I went to. It's actually now in the Ukraine. And his story was that he left his family before World War I. He was the only one to survive the Holocaust. So I never got to meet them. And the reason was he came, and then he actually went to Palestine, which is Israel, and then came back. They were all murdered. And when I went to the Ukraine, we actually found out what happened to his family. But I have met, many survivors. And they're just, they're normal people who were very lucky for different reasons, but they all suffer greatly. They all have their different stories, just like all of you have their different stories. And many survivors went through such trauma. They did what they had to do. They, untold horrors, but they survived that. A lot of the people tried to push that down. But they're almost all dead. So, let's go. You're not getting out of here until you ask me 45 questions. Stuart.
First of all, I've been doing this for a few years, and this was most brilliant and interesting presentation that I've heard. Thank you.
Stuart never says a bad thing about anybody. So.
In America, we've come a long way. But where do you see our biggest problems of intolerance?
Sure. So I don't want to be overtly political, but I do have an agenda. My agenda is that the democracy of this country be maintained, and that this country be a guiding light to people. Just like, there's a saying in Judaism that Jews should be a light amongst the nations. Well, I'll put my lawyer hat on. I studied in depth the history of the United States Constitution and how it was found in the Federalist Papers, and this is very important. So this is one of those facts. You guys have not studied the Constitution like I have, or but if you need to understand, I urge you to understand the founding of this country and what a democracy is. So there's all sorts of political systems around the world. We don't have to have a democracy. Germany was a democracy, ended up being a fascist dictatorship that ended up murdering, in total, about 60 million people because of all the wars. Democracy is actually very fragile. And there's a lot of historical references on how, especially in Germany, which I could give, we don't have time for it. Arthur is an expert at that, he could give it to you. But things can turn very quickly. So to answer your question, I'll answer it directly. I think that leaders need to be honest. Leaders need to, and mentors, you could say, need to set a high tone, to be guiding lights to people. They need to have the best interests of the populace at heart. And my strong belief is that this president does not do that. And he's a grave danger to this country. That's the short answer. And I could talk about that for a long time. Yeah.
What do you suggest that the average American citizen can do in their daily lives to improve their tolerance for others? If you could teach her.
Yeah, she wanted to know what can an average person do to increase their tolerance for others. And I think everybody has to do it their own way, but I think it goes down to just being kind to everybody. you know, and if you see an elderly person, you see someone with a physical or mental handicap, you see someone who's sad, you see a child in need, you see a friend who has a problem. If you're just kind to everybody, everyone will be kind back to you. And if they're not, then that's the harder problem. If you have a friend who's a bully and, you know, gives you a hard time, what do you do about it? You know, my reaction would be just stay away from that person. But, you know, sometimes you can't. So everybody has to judge the situation alone. But I think if you develop this feeling of, the overall theme in Christianity is love, right? So if you love everybody, and if you have this respect for everybody, and if you see a situation that you know is wrong, regardless what it is, seek help from other people. I think that's an important thing. As you go through life, you go through college, hopefully, you get jobs, hopefully, you have families, hopefully. You're going to be in situations that are uncomfortable, maybe dangerous. Think about them. Or if you see a friend who's drinking and driving, just little things like that. Your respect for them, saying, hey, I care about you, let me help you, that's an act of tolerance. Yes, ma'am?
Which piece of art was the most meaningful
Oh.
for you?
That's like saying, which of my children do I like best? But actually, today, as my daughter's in the back, she can raise her hand. So that's my daughter, Julianne. So I have 4 children. Well, if you look at the book, they're all very different. But these are, and the assignment I gave myself was almost an impossible one, which was make a piece of art or pieces of art that portray the horrors of genocide. Now, how's that for an assignment if an art teacher gave you that, right? So, I think I've been very successful at that because of the reaction when people have come in and seen that. So I like them all, but they're all very different. I have. You look in the book, you'll see I made an artist statement in here, and it's tough stuff. It's talking about death and why these things happen. And I think in the back there's an email. If you care to email me, I'll answer you back some questions if you want. But the important thing about it to me is I felt I had to do it. I was very passionate about it. Before I had this trip, and I had no intention of doing anything like this. So that's something you'll see in your life. Your life will change quickly for one reason or another. You'll take a job, you hate it, whatever, you'll meet somebody, you'll go somewhere else. You might have 7 different jobs, and it's the last one you say, this is for me, this is my life, this is my passion. So I found this in this project. I wear a lot of different hats, I do a lot of different things, I'm passionate about a lot of things, but in my art, find something, and here's a good mentorship tip, find something in your life you're very passionate about, whether it's work or helping other people or whatever it is. That'll be a great source of inspiration to you, which will allow you to be inspirational to other people. My best friend died when he was 50. He was the most brilliant guy I knew. And right before he died, he kept saying, I feel bad, I'm dying. Even if I live to be 90, it's still a short time. He says, think about it. In 100 years, there's all new people. Right? 100 years from now, none of us will be here, probably. Which means, though, society will still be here. What's this kind of society will we have? Will we have a society like Soviet Union was, or Nazi Germany, or ancient Rome, or the American democracy where everyone is valued as envisioned by our founding fathers? Or do we have something else? Is that they talk about dystopian future, some awful, evil future. It's very important. Yes, Leonardo, my friend Leonardo.
Have you transmit tolerance to
How do I transmit tolerance through my art? I think the goal of it is for people to feel the horrors of and it's, again, a hard thing to do. In the book, I have this very big sculpture, which are starving inmates at a concentration camp in bunks. It's 20 feet across, 20 feet deep, 9 feet tall. And when people see that, they react. It's like, how could we do this? And if you think about it, if you put yourself, all those faces in that sculpture are my face. There's 65 sculptures. And so if I put myself in that, try to imagine, which you can't, but I try, imagine myself in that sculpture, in that scene, I want the viewer to do that too. And if you are that inmate, how could you ever treat anybody else poorly? You couldn't. So that's how. That's a good question. Yes, ma'am?
Because of everything your family has gone through in the past, do you find that you're a more humble person because of it?
And more what?
A humble person?
Humility, another good question. Well, if you ask my wife, she'll say no. This is my wife, Lorraine, back there. You know, I would say this. I was very lucky. I didn't experience any of this. It was my father, my grandparents. I grew up in a very middle class, you know, background in a Midwestern city. You know, I don't know how to answer the question. It's a great question. I would say I don't lack for confidence, but I like to think I'm humble. And by that, meaning I care about what other people think. But this is also another good mentorship thing. I'm also very confident, hopefully well-founded, in the decisions I make and what I do. And you know, you do your best, you make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. You learn more from your failures and your mistakes, for sure, than you do your successes. You make a mistake, it could be anything. I drove the car when I shouldn't have, or whatever it is. And hopefully you live through it. But those kinds of things are important. So another great question. Yes, Steve.
See if I can tie two things together. Early on in your talk, you talked about the guy driving a train in Germany or one of the other countries. Even though he knew what was going on in the train,
Right.
he just went around, that's his job, and he just chose avoidance to ignore the reality of what was going on. And then you, a little bit further on, you talked about how easy it would be for our country to slip into some kind of, to become some kind of a country that we wouldn't recognize today.
Yes.
Well, after World War, 1943, 44, 45, anybody that cared to look in the United States who knew what was there was enough information going on about the Holocaust. But people just went along and went about their way with very few exceptions.
So, Arthur Berger, I actually have a website, and Arthur's on the website giving a speech on that topic. Part of his scholarly work is on the U.S. State Department and Franklin Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust. And there's many books on it, but Arthur has a speech on it, exactly on that. And, you know, they sort of had other priorities. They could have bombed the tracks, they could have done a lot of things, they could have stood up, just like right now. There's, you know, genocides have continued, Rwanda, Myanmar, and Syria. The question is, from a governmental policy view, who runs that agenda, what's most important, and you know, there's always competing interests. So at the time, there was a very isolationist movement called America First. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
Trump uses that. And that was basically the Nazi sympathizers in the United States saying, yeah, keep the US out of it, it's okay. We don't really care so much about the Jews. So, you know, That was their, yes, sir.
Well, you could also say how the leadership in that time was mostly, back in the day, kind of like, we don't care about what's going on outside of the United States because of the current problems they had in the economy, you know, the Great Depression, and also the leaders in that time weren't very sympathetic to other nations. They were very, I don't want to say racist or
You can say it.
but they're like kind of like leaning towards that direction, where they rejected also refugees, like Jewish refugees. They didn't accept African American athletes into the White House when they're supposed to.
Right.
So that's also a big factor to why America First was applied there, because they didn't want, not because they didn't also care about themselves, but they didn't want to involve themselves with others.
Bravo. Here's a young man who knows good history. So that's exactly right. And you know, history will repeat. And you have to look at the motivation of people, even the mentors. You know, why are these men and women here talking to you? Well, ask them. They'll tell you. You know, they're here to help you because maybe somebody helped them along the way. They're here because they feel fortunate. It's very important. But if you would ask, you know, somebody, then you know they tell you we don't care about that. We want what's ours. We want to protect the United States. We want to put a wall around our country. We don't want those other people here, whether it's the Chinese at one point, or the Irish, or the Polish, or the Jews. This country's been built, everybody here, except for the Native Americans, which were wiped out by the Europeans who came. Everybody here is an immigrant, family of an immigrant. So, you know, it gets difficult. So there's, you know, you have to understand nationalism between countries. You have to understand religious differences. You know, every religion has a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. There's, you know, very good lessons to be learned. You know, and sometimes you have to understand the time at which those religions were created. So it goes on and on and on. But the more you know about that, the better your tools on how to navigate the current society, and then you develop your moral guidance around that. And you pick a lot up around your home, and influenced by those people. But you know, you should always challenge everybody, and say, well, why do you think that? And you know, think, what's your agenda? What do you want from me? What can I do for you? You know, everybody, not everybody's intentions are pure. Yes, sir.
Earlier, you briefly mentioned how you discovered part of your family's history and your family's life. Can you just sort of describe what was going through your mind?
Yeah, I'll tell you one particular story. So we're in the Ukraine, which is a tough place. At the time, this is 2015, they were at war for 2 years with the Soviet Union, of all things. They still are. The economy is awful. People are very poor. So anyway, we're there. We go to this little town called Bolkhov. Bolkhov, they call it a shtetl, Yiddish word for meaning like a little peasant town, where my grandfather was from. Bolkhov in 1939 had 7,800 people. 4,800 were Jews. 41 survived the war. All my grandfather's family was wiped out. So the most remarkable thing that happened, we spent a day there, and we found out where they were murdered and how they were murdered, and my great aunts who were younger. So we went to the Jewish cemetery in Bolkhov later in the day, and you can't now, even in current Ukraine, you can't go to a map and say, I want to see the Jewish cemetery. There's no Jewish reference to anything. That was the Soviet mentality, the Soviet anti-Semitism. And there's no Jews that live there, by the way. They were all killed, or they moved out. None. Maybe a few little in Rostov. Today I met a rabbi from the Ukraine. And we went to this cemetery, which was, so Jews had lived in Poland for about 1,000 years. And there were 4,800 Jews, that lived there, you know, these families, successor, everyone had been buried in this cemetery. It was about 30 acres. And, but when the Nazis came into town, they would always send the young boys in town in with sledgehammers to break up all the gravestones. And they would take some always, this was just their psychological warfare. They'd take gravestones, they put them in the main town square, they run their tanks over them and march on them. And then they would bring the leading Jewish citizens in town and shoot them in the square, and then they would round up the other people and shoot them. So that's what happens when democracy breaks down. Okay. So we're in this cemetery, and I count. So there may have been 30,000 people buried there over the last 900 years. I counted there were 81 gravestones left. They were, you know, crooked and laying on the ground. 81 left. So our guide said, okay, well, I was out taking pictures, said, maybe I'll see something interesting. He goes to the first gravestone he goes to, he starts screaming, and he said, this is your grandfather's, maternal grandfather's grave, who died in about 1900. But he knew, because he could speak Yiddish. So it was in Yiddish, which is Hebrew letters in German, and he knew from that, and from that, he was able to get his father's name, and we were able to later trace the name. So when you asked how did I feel, it was the miracle. I don't believe in miracles. That was a miracle. It was like, how could that be? The first one he goes to, in this place where there were 30,000 gravestones, only 81 left, was my great-great-grandfather's grave. And I came back to see that with my sister. Pretty good. Yes, sir.
Bruce,
Ward.
we talk about tolerance today a lot, and you do business around the country. How do you see the interaction between legislated tolerance, rules that require tolerance, and the kind of tolerance we're talking about here today where it's interpersonal?
Give me an example of legislative tolerance.
The Disabilities Act.
No.
Anything that's legislated that prevents there from being biases or unfair treatment.
I don't know how to answer that. You know, I'd sort of say maybe that's above my pay grade. I don't know. You know, but I'll comment on it another way. When you say it, I do business in a lot of different places around the country. I do, and what astounds me is that, you know, what do you look for in someone to do business with? Now, whatever business, it could be a lawyer, it could be a doctor, it could be a store, you know, so you have to, so this is another mentorship thing. You think about it. And I've had clients, or potential clients, or former clients come up to me and said, you know, basically you're Jewish, I don't want to do business with you. So that's like a direct experience of, you know, I'll call it minor anti-Semitism. You know, I think your question was something else. You know, I haven't seen a problem with that.
Well, how do you deal with intolerance within your employee group when you see it?
I don't have any employees that are intolerant. I have a culture that's just the opposite. They wouldn't get that far. And if I found somebody, it's maybe happened. I've been in business 40 years. If I found somebody who I thought was intolerant, I'd fire them immediately. Because that's not our culture. There are other firms that that's their culture, it's fine. You know, you're a bureaucrat, go to the end of the line, come back. You're a minority, I don't need to deal with you.
What if it's a great salesman?
I don't care. It wouldn't be, I wouldn't hire him. So, I guess I'm getting the hook. I'd be glad to sit and talk a little bit, answer any questions. I have an email in the back of this book if anyone wants to email, talk about art or anything else, or questions about anything. But the big lesson is you have no idea how lucky you are to be in this program. This is the answer to the problem of intolerance. That even if you could start younger, you could start at 6 years old, and here you are, seniors in high school, and you're in this exciting part of your life. But if you can be exposed to different ways of thinking and different types of people, and develop a way with your homework and the resources that come here and your mentors, a way to think about the world differently and in many, many different ways, you will be a very tolerant person. You'll be a very successful person. You'll figure out a path in your life. And you're very lucky. Because how many are there? There's 40 of you, and there's millions of students in the country who would benefit from this. Many people don't have mentors to talk to that are positive mentors. Maybe it's a gang leader. Maybe it's, the crack dealer. Maybe it's, friends who just like to get drunk on the weekend. Those aren't good mentors. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best of luck. And I hope to hear from every single one of you in 10 years, and I want to hear about all your success. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. So we're going to now break for 8 minutes. So we'll start at 6:05. We'll